To the public, Rob Reiner and Meg Ryan are permanently sealed inside the same soft-lit chapter of Hollywood history, a time when romantic comedies felt sincere and endings felt earned. They represent an era people return to when the present feels too loud or too cynical. That is why the reaction was instant when the headline appeared. Meg Ryan finally reveals the truth about Rob Reiner. Fans were stunned, not because of what was said, but because of who was saying it. Meg Ryan had always been careful, restrained, almost guarded in how she spoke about the industry. When someone like that appears to shift her tone, the world leans in, not to listen, but to interpret. The truth, however, did not arrive as a dramatic confession or a single explosive quote. It arrived the way uncomfortable truths usually do, slowly, through context and implication. In recent interviews, Meg Ryan has spoken less about nostalgia and more about cost. The cost of fame, the cost of being agreeable, the cost of being the woman everyone wants you to be rather than the person you actually are. She spoke about power without assigning names, about creative environments that demanded silence in exchange for opportunity. And in Hollywood, silence is rarely neutral. It is learned. Rob Reiner's name entered the conversation not because she accused him directly, but because history placed them in the same frame. He is remembered as a director with authority and confidence, someone who knew how to control rhythm, tone, and performance. Those qualities are praised in men. They are described as leadership. But leadership, in practice, is also power. And power shapes rooms in ways that are invisible to audiences who only see the finished film. Meg Ryan, at the height of her fame, carried a different kind of power, one built on trust and likability. That power, paradoxically, left her with fewer options. Because when you're America's sweetheart, you are expected to smile through discomfort and call it professionalism. Fans searching for a scandal missed the deeper point. What Meg Ryan appeared to be revealing was not a secret about one man, but a truth about a system. A system that rewards women for being pleasant and punishes them for being precise. A system where a director's intensity is celebrated until someone asks how it felt on the other side of that intensity. The internet did what it always does, pulling apart old interviews, rewatching behind-the-scenes clips, reinterpreting moments that once seemed harmless. Certainty was built from fragments. But the real tension lives in the gray area, in the space between what can be proven and what can be felt. If Meg Ryan is reclaiming her narrative now, it is not because she wants revenge. It is because time changes perspective. Years later, what once felt normal can suddenly feel wrong. What once felt like the price of success can start to feel like something you should never have had to pay. That is what unsettles people. Not the idea that a beloved figure might be flawed, but the realization that the stories we loved were created inside environments we never questioned. By the end of this first chapter, one thing becomes clear. The shock is not about a revelation. It is about recognition. Recognition that Hollywood's golden age was not golden for everyone, and that silence was often mistaken for consent. Meg Ryan does not need to accuse anyone for the truth to land. All she has to do is stop protecting the myth. And once that protection ends, the past no longer looks the way it used to. What unsettles people most about Meg Ryan's shift in tone is not what she says, but what she no longer feels obligated to soften. For years, she was asked to revisit the same questions, framed the same way, always pulling her back into a version of herself that existed primarily for public comfort. The smiling interviews, the charming anecdotes, the careful avoidance of anything that might fracture the memory audiences prefer to keep intact. That kind of repetition does something to a person. It teaches you which truths are acceptable and which ones will be quietly ignored. Over time, silence stops feeling like a choice and starts feeling like a reflex. When Meg Ryan speaks now, she sounds less interested in preserving a legacy and more interested in understanding it. She talks about moments that made her question the cost of staying agreeable, about how certain dynamics felt confusing at the time and only became clear much later. That delay matters, because power rarely announces itself as harm in the moment. It presents itself as opportunity, as mentorship, as this is just how it works. And when you are young, celebrated, and surrounded by people who benefit from your compliance, questioning that narrative feels like betrayal, not of others, but of your own success. This is where the conversation around Rob Reiner becomes emotionally charged. He symbolizes, for many fans, a safe kind of authority. The director who understood warmth. The man behind stories that taught audiences how to listen to each other. That image is powerful, and it is not easily dismantled. But images are not experiences. What Meg Ryan's words suggest is not that there was a single moment of rupture, but a collection of small moments that added up to something heavier than any one incident. Moments where her instincts told her something fell off, and the culture around her told her to ignore that feeling and be grateful. Hollywood has always been skilled at turning discomfort into mythology. Intense sets are described as passionate. Emotional strain is reframed as artistic sacrifice. Women who endure it quietly are praised as professionals. Women who name it are labeled difficult. Meg Ryan watched that pattern play out not just around her, but through her. She became a symbol of ease, which meant she was rarely allowed to admit when things were not easy. That contradiction is exhausting, and exhaustion has a way of sharpening memory. Fans want clarity. They want to know whether Rob Reiner did something wrong, whether there is a villain hiding behind the familiar smile. But the truth Meg Ryan gestures toward does not fit neatly into that framework. It asks a more uncomfortable question. What happens when good intentions exist inside systems that still cause harm? What happens when no one thinks they're the bad guy, but someone still leaves the room feeling smaller than when they entered it? Those are the stories that never make headlines, because they do not end cleanly. The reason fans are stunned is not because Meg Ryan is tearing someone down. It is because she is no longer holding herself responsible for maintaining a fantasy. She is allowing complexity to exist where simplicity once reigned. And complexity threatens nostalgia. It forces people to reconsider what they admired and why they admired it. It asks whether we were cheering for warmth or simply ignoring the cost at which that warmth was produced. Time has given Meg Ryan something she did not have at her peak: distance. Distance from the pressure to be liked. Distance from the fear of being replaced. Distance from the idea that her worth depended on how smoothly she fit into someone else's vision. With that distance comes clarity, and clarity often arrives without anger. It arrives as honesty, calm, precise, and deeply unsettling because it cannot be dismissed as bitterness. Rob Reiner, like many powerful figures of his era, exists within that reckoning whether he welcomes it or not. The cultural moment has shifted. People are no longer satisfied with stories that end at the box office. They want to know what happened behind the scenes, who had control, and who absorbed the consequences. That does not automatically make him guilty of something unforgivable, but it does place his legacy in conversation with voices that were once sidelined. What Meg Ryan seems to understand now is that protecting the past does not protect the people who lived through it. It only preserves an image. And images do not feel pressure or doubt or regret. People do. By choosing to speak in a way that prioritizes her own understanding over public approval, she disrupts the balance that once kept everything looking effortless. That disruption is quiet, but it is profound. As this story continues, the focus shifts away from shock and toward meaning, away from rumors and toward reflection. The real question is no longer what Meg Ryan has revealed, but what she has finally stopped hiding from herself. And once that line is crossed, there is no returning to the simpler version of the story. The past may still be beloved, but it is no longer untouchable. There's a moment that often arrives late in life, long after the applause fades, when memory stops performing and starts telling the truth. Not the dramatic truth that satisfies an audience, but the personal truth that refuses to be edited. For Meg Ryan, that moment seems to have come quietly, without announcement, without accusation. And that is precisely why it feels so destabilizing. She is not rewriting history. She is reinterpreting her place within it. That distinction matters, because reinterpretation does not require villains. It requires honesty. For years, Meg Ryan's image worked against her ability to be taken seriously when she spoke about discomfort. Sweetness in Hollywood is treated as an aesthetic rather than a boundary. It invites familiarity without protection. Directors, producers, executives often mistake it for availability, for emotional flexibility, for resilience that does not need checking in on. When Meg Ryan reflects on her experiences now, she is not describing trauma in the language of crisis. She is describing erosion, the slow wearing down of autonomy that happens when every room you enter is already organized around someone else's authority. This is why the connection to Rob Reiner continues to provoke such intense reaction. He is not an obvious antagonist. He represents a class of powerful creatives who are widely respected, whose behavior fit comfortably within the norms of their time. Norms, however, are not neutral. They are agreements shaped by those with the least to lose. What Meg Ryan seems to be acknowledging is that she internalized those norms for a long time, convincing herself that discomfort was simply part of the job. That recognition, arriving decades later, can feel both clarifying and devastating. Fans often ask why she did not speak sooner. It is a question that misunderstands how power operates. Speaking sooner would have required certainty she did not yet have. It would have required a language that did not exist in the same way it does now. More importantly, it would have required a willingness to risk everything she had worked for. Silence was not cowardice. It was strategy. It was survival. And survival, while effective, leaves residue. When Meg Ryan talks about control now, she does so with the calm of someone who no longer needs permission to interpret her own life. She acknowledges that creative environments can be simultaneously productive and harmful, that admiration and imbalance often coexist. This complicates the desire for a clean moral verdict. It resists the internet's hunger for a single headline that explains everything. Instead, it leaves us with questions we're not accustomed to sitting with. Rob Reiner's legacy, like that of many celebrated figures, is being examined through a wider lens. Not to erase his contributions, but to contextualize them. Context is uncomfortable because it refuses to simplify. It asks us to hold two truths at once: that meaningful art can come from flawed systems, and that those systems exact costs we were taught not to notice. Meg Ryan's evolving narrative forces that duality into the open. What makes fans uneasy is not the possibility that their heroes were imperfect. It is the realization that imperfection was once protected by collective silence. Meg Ryan was part of that silence, not as an architect, but as a participant shaped by circumstances larger than herself. To name that now is not an act of betrayal. It is an act of self-recognition. She is no longer interested in preserving the comfort of an audience that never had to navigate those rooms. There's also grief in this process. Grief for the version of herself that believed endurance would be rewarded with safety. Grief for the years spent translating discomfort into professionalism. Grief for the narratives she upheld because she did not yet have the tools to dismantle them. This grief does not need an enemy. It needs space. And for the first time, Meg Ryan seems willing to take that space publicly. As the conversation continues, the shock will likely fade, replaced by something quieter and more lasting. A reevaluation not just of one relationship, but of an entire era. Romantic comedies may still feel warm, but the industries that produce them will no longer feel untouchable. Meg Ryan's voice, once defined by charm, is now defined by clarity. That clarity does not shout. It does not accuse. It simply refuses to keep pretending that what felt normal was always acceptable. The story moving forward is not about exposing secrets. It is about allowing complexity to exist without apology. And once complexity is admitted, the past can no longer be consumed as pure fantasy. It becomes human, messy, incomplete. That transformation may disappoint some fans, but it offers something more honest in return. a chance to understand that even the brightest eras were shaped by shadows, and that naming those shadows is not an attack on art, but an acknowledgement of the people who lived inside it. As the noise around Meg Ryan's words continues to swell, something subtle but significant begins to happen. The conversation shifts away from her as an object of curiosity and toward her as an authority on her own experience. That shift is unsettling precisely because it removes the audience from its most comfortable position. No longer are fans merely consuming a story. They're being asked implicitly to reconsider how they participated in the culture that shaped it. Meg Ryan's calm refusal to dramatize her reflections forces that reconsideration to happen without spectacle. For decades, Hollywood relied on a simple trade. It offered visibility, validation, and access in exchange for compliance. Those who accepted the terms were celebrated. Those who questioned them were quietly sidelined. Meg Ryan was celebrated at a scale few actors ever experience, which meant the pressure to uphold the unspoken contract was immense. Every interview reinforced the same version of her identity. Every public appearance affirmed a narrative of ease. Over time, that narrative hardened into expectation, and expectation left little room for dissent. What emerges now, in her more measured reflections, is not bitterness but accountability directed inward. She speaks as someone who has revisited her past with honesty rather than nostalgia. She does not claim she was powerless. She acknowledges that she made choices within constraints, choices that made sense at the time. This nuance frustrates those looking for a dramatic reckoning. It denies them a villain and refuses to grant them moral certainty. Instead, it exposes the quieter truth that systems can be damaging even when individuals believe they are behaving appropriately. Rob Reiner's presence in this story remains largely symbolic. He represents a generation of filmmakers whose authority was rarely questioned and whose creative control was normalized as necessary. His reputation was built on competence, on an ability to guide performances toward emotional authenticity. Yet authenticity on screen does not guarantee balance behind the scenes. Meg Ryan's reflections invite consideration of how often emotional labor was demanded of performers without acknowledgement, how often professionalism meant absorbing discomfort without complaint. The internet's insistence on extracting a confession misunderstands the nature of what is being shared. Meg Ryan is not revealing secrets in a conventional sense. She is articulating realizations that took time to form, realizations that required distance from the machine that once defined her. Distance allows patterns to emerge. It reveals how often silence was mistaken for consent and how rarely the emotional experiences of women were centered in discussions of creative success. There's also a broader cultural reckoning unfolding in parallel. Audiences are no longer content with myths that exclude consequence. They are increasingly willing to accept that beloved works may have been created within environments that prioritized output over well-being. This does not diminish the art, but complicates its legacy. Meg Ryan's voice contributes to that complication, not by tearing down the past, but by refusing to idealize it. Her decision to speak differently now carries risk, even at this stage of her life. Public narratives are difficult to reshape once they solidify. Any deviation is treated as revisionism. Yet Meg Ryan seems untroubled by that reaction. Her focus appears less on public approval and more on personal coherence. She is aligning her public words with her private understanding, and that alignment has a quiet power. What fans are truly responding to is not shock, but dissonance. The dissonance between the image they cherished and the reality she describes. That discomfort prompts defensive reactions, demands for clarity, and attempts to reframe her words as either accusation or misunderstanding. But the strength of her position lies in its refusal to conform to those binaries. She is not accusing. She is not absolving. She is contextualizing. As this chapter closes, the story no longer belongs solely to Meg Ryan or Rob Reiner. It belongs to an era that is being re-examined through voices that were once expected to remain pleasant and silent. The stunned reaction from fans reflects a deeper unease about what happens when cultural icons step outside the roles assigned to them. Meg Ryan is no longer the symbol of uncomplicated romance. She is a witness to a system that shaped her and a participant in its unraveling. The conversation will continue, not because new revelations emerge, but because old assumptions are being dismantled. The truth she offers is not a headline. It is a lens. And once that lens is applied, Hollywood's past can no longer be viewed without distortion. It becomes layered, contradictory, and human. That may not satisfy those craving spectacle, but it offers something far more enduring: understanding. As time passes and the immediate shock dulls, a quieter, more uncomfortable realization begins to surface. The story surrounding Meg Ryan and Rob Reiner was never really about a revelation. It was about permission. Permission for a woman, once defined entirely by her appeal and accessibility, to speak without cushioning her words for public comfort. Meg Ryan is not rewriting her past to condemn it. She is reclaiming the authority to describe it honestly, and that act alone disrupts decades of expectation. Hollywood has always preferred its icons predictable. The industry builds careers by shaping people into symbols, then protects those symbols because they are profitable. Meg Ryan's symbol was warmth. Her presence reassured audiences that love was safe, that sincerity could survive cynicism. But symbols are not allowed to age naturally. They are frozen in time, replayed endlessly, while the person behind them continues to live, to learn, to reinterpret their own experiences. When Meg Ryan steps outside that frozen image, the discomfort people feel is not betrayal. It is grief for a fantasy that no longer fits. Her reflections also highlight a truth many performers understand but rarely articulate. Success does not eliminate vulnerability. In some cases, it amplifies it. The more beloved you are, the more invested others become in controlling your narrative. Directors, studios, and audiences all claim a piece of you. Decisions are made around you rather than with you. Gratitude is expected to replace agency. When Meg Ryan talks about control now, she is naming that dynamic without dramatizing it. She is describing a structure that normalized imbalance and called it collaboration. Rob Reiner's role in this conversation remains indirect, yet unavoidable. He stands in for the authority figures of his era, men whose creative vision was rarely challenged and whose methods were rarely scrutinized. This does not automatically render him malicious, but it does place him within a system that privileged his perspective. Meg Ryan's evolving narrative invites audiences to consider how often that privilege went unquestioned and how many people adjusted themselves around it to keep working. What makes her words resonate now is the cultural moment in which they land. Audiences are more willing to accept complexity, more open to the idea that beloved stories may have been born in imperfect conditions. The desire for clean heroes has weakened. In its place is a hunger for context. Meg Ryan offers that context not as an exposé, but as lived experience filtered through time. She's not asking for sympathy. She is asking for recognition. There is courage in that restraint. It would be easier to lean into outrage, to satisfy the public appetite for drama. Instead, she maintains control over her narrative by refusing to exaggerate it. Her clarity exposes how often women were expected to absorb discomfort quietly and then smile for the camera. It reveals how professionalism was weaponized against self-expression. And it challenges the assumption that silence meant contentment. As fans grapple with this reframing, they are forced to confront their own role in maintaining myths. Nostalgia is powerful because it simplifies. It removes friction. It allows us to consume the past without questioning its construction. Meg Ryan's willingness to complicate that nostalgia does not destroy it. It matures it. It transforms admiration into understanding, and understanding is always less comfortable than fantasy. The story moving forward is not about what will be revealed next, but but about how audiences choose to listen. Will they demand scandal, or will they accept nuance? Will they cling to the safety of familiar narratives, or will they allow those narratives to evolve alongside the people who live them? Meg Ryan has made her choice clear. She is no longer interested in being preserved as an artifact of a simpler time. By the end of this chapter, the stunned reaction begins to look less like shock and more like adjustment. Adjustment to the idea that icons can speak for themselves without playing a role. Adjustment to the reality that power, even when exercised without cruelty, can still leave marks. Meg Ryan's voice, steady and unembellished, lingers not because of what it accuses, but because of what it acknowledges. In allowing that acknowledgement into the public space, she reshapes the legacy of an era without dismantling it. She proves that truth does not need to be loud to be transformative. Sometimes it only needs to be finally spoken. What ultimately gives Meg Ryan's words their weight is not revelation, but resolution. Not closure in the cinematic sense, but a personal alignment that no longer depends on external validation. She is not stepping forward to correct the record for historians or to satisfy a restless audience. She is stepping forward to correct it for herself. And that distinction changes everything. When a person no longer needs approval to tell their own story, the story becomes harder to dismiss. For years, Meg Ryan existed inside a paradox. She was visible everywhere, yet heard selectively. Her image spoke louder than her voice. Interviews framed her as effortless, untroubled, eternally agreeable. The more the public adored that version of her, the narrower her margin for honesty became. Any deviation from charm risked being read as ingratitude. Any critique risked being labeled bitterness. Silence, in that context, was not emptiness. It was containment. As she reflects now, Meg Ryan appears to understand that containment came at a cost. Not a catastrophic one, but a cumulative one. The kind that builds quietly, the kind you only recognize once it has passed. She speaks as someone who has revisited old moments with new eyes, noticing the compromises she normalized and the instincts she postponed. This is not regret as self-punishment. It is regret as information finally processed. Rob Reiner's place in this narrative remains less about individual blame and more about institutional memory. He symbolizes an era when authority flowed in one direction and questions flowed in none. His reputation as a skilled, confident director fits comfortably within that framework. But frameworks, once examined, reveal who they favored and who adapted around them. Meg Ryan's account suggests that adaptation was expected, not negotiated. The resistance to her reframing reveals a deeper anxiety. If her experience is valid without requiring spectacle, then countless other experiences must be valid too. Experiences that never made headlines because they lacked a single dramatic incident. Experiences defined by imbalance rather than abuse, by expectation rather than coercion. Accepting that reality forces a reconsideration of how success stories were told and who they left out. What Meg Ryan offers instead of accusation is language. Language for feelings that were once dismissed as part of the job. Language for discomfort that did not rise to scandal but still mattered. Language for the realization that being valued does not guarantee being protected. This language is dangerous to myths because it cannot be argued away with denial. It does not attack. It clarifies. There is also a quiet generosity in her approach. She does not demand that audiences discard the films they love. She does not insist that admiration be replaced with condemnation. She allows space for coexistence, for appreciation alongside acknowledgement. That balance is difficult, and it is rarely rewarded online. Yet it is precisely that balance that gives her words credibility. As this story approaches its end, the stunned reaction gives way to something more reflective. People begin to recognize themselves in the pattern she describes. Not just performers, but anyone who has learned to accommodate power rather than confront it. Anyone who has smiled through discomfort because the alternative felt too risky. Meg Ryan's experience becomes less about Hollywood and more about a universal negotiation between selfhood and survival. Her voice now carries a steadiness that suggests she is no longer negotiating. She is no longer asking permission to interpret her own life. That steadiness reframes the past without erasing it. It allows her to honor what was meaningful while acknowledging what was limiting. It accepts that growth often requires revisiting old stories and telling them differently. In the end, the truth Meg Ryan reveals is not a secret hidden behind closed doors. It is a perspective unlocked by time. A reminder that silence is not the absence of experience, but often the presence of restraint. And when that restraint lifts, what emerges is rarely explosive. It is precise, grounded, unavoidable. The legacy of this moment will not be measured in headlines or trending clips. It will be measured in how future stories are told, in whether voices like hers are allowed to exist without being flattened into symbols. Meg Ryan does not dismantle an era. She completes her place within it. And in doing so, she leaves behind something more enduring than shock. She leaves clarity. When the dust finally settles, what remains is not controversy, but coherence. Meg Ryan's story reaches a point where it no longer asks to be debated. It asks to be understood. That is the quiet power of her evolution. She does not position herself as a victim, nor does she frame herself as a hero. She presents herself as a person who has lived long enough to recognize patterns she once accepted without question. And recognition, when it arrives honestly, does not need witnesses to be valid. For a long time, Meg Ryan's absence from the center of Hollywood conversation was interpreted as retreat. People assumed she stepped back because the spotlight moved on, because trends change, because the industry is unforgiving. What her recent reflections suggest is something more deliberate. Distance was not defeat. It was perspective. Stepping away allowed her to separate who she was from what she represented. It gave her the space to examine how much of her identity had been shaped by expectation rather than choice. That distance also exposes why the public reaction feels so charged. Audiences are accustomed to stories that end with lessons neatly tied up, with accountability assigned clearly and quickly. Meg Ryan's truth refuses that structure. It unfolds without urgency. It carries no demand for retribution. Instead, it invites a reassessment of how power was normalized and how often emotional labor went unnamed. That invitation is harder to accept than accusation, because it requires participation rather than judgment. Rob Reiner's legacy remains intact in many ways, but it now exists alongside a broader understanding of the environment in which that legacy was built. This coexistence is uncomfortable for those who prefer absolutes. Yet it reflects reality more accurately than any simplified narrative ever could. People are shaped by systems, and systems persist because they are rarely challenged from within. Meg Ryan's voice does not dismantle those systems retroactively. It simply illuminates their impact. What makes this moment significant is not its potential to scandalize, but its potential to recalibrate. It recalibrates how we listen to women who were once defined by their appeal. It recalibrates how we interpret silence, not as absence, but as evidence of constraint. And it recalibrates how we understand success, not as proof of fulfillment, but as something that can coexist with compromise. As the conversation fades from headlines into memory, Meg Ryan's words linger because they resonate beyond celebrity culture. They echo in workplaces where power dynamics are subtle but persistent. They echo in relationships where gratitude is expected to replace autonomy. They echo in lives where people learn to adapt first and question later. Her experience becomes a mirror rather than a spectacle. In the end, the truth she reveals is deceptively simple. You can be celebrated and still feel constrained. You can be successful and still carry unanswered questions. You can create something beautiful within a system that does not fully see you. Naming those truths does not erase the beauty. It contextualizes it. It gives it depth. Meg Ryan does not ask the world to see her differently overnight. She simply stops participating in the performance that once defined her. That refusal is not loud, but it is final. And in that finality, there is a kind of peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace of alignment. Her public voice now matches her private understanding. Fans may have arrived expecting shock, but what they encounter instead is maturity. A woman no longer interested in being preserved as a symbol, choosing instead to exist as herself. That choice reframes the past without destroying it and opens space for future stories to be told with greater honesty. When history looks back on this moment, it will not mark it as a scandal. It will mark it as a shift. The moment when a familiar smile gave way to a clear voice, and the industry, however briefly, had to listen.